Absolute spirit, as pictured in pure essence, is not indeed abstract pure essence, for abstract essence has sunk to the level of being merely an element, just because it is only a moment in the life of spirit. But the representation of spirit in this element is charged with the same defect of form which essence as such has. Essence is an abstraction, and is therefore the negation of its simple unitary nature, is another. Similarly, spirit in the element of essence is the form of simple oneness, which therefore is equally, essentially, an othering of itself. Or, what is the same thing, the relation of the eternal being to its being for self is the immediately simple one of pure thought. In this simple beholding of itself in the otherness is therefore not posited as such. It is the difference which in pure thought is immediately no difference. A loving recognition in which the two sides, as regards their essence, do not stand in an antithetical relation to each other. Spirit that is expressed in the element of pure thought is itself essentially this, to be not merely in its element, but to be actual spirit. For its notion lies otherness itself, that is, the supersession of the pure notion that is only thought. Paragraph 772 is rather short, as is the paragraph immediately following it, and it seems very abstract and metaphysical in what is going on here. But this is a very important, not so much turning point as in development that's going to feed into what's going to be happening in paragraphs yet to come, and which is showing us a kind of culmination of where the previous paragraphs have been leading us. We're trying to make sense out of, and there's a couple different ways to conceptualize this, essence, or spirit in the element of essence, or eternal being or essence. You're going to notice that if you look at the German for this section, lots and lots of Wesen coming up, right? And you can translate Wesen as essence. You can also translate it as being, understanding that we're talking about essential being, right? And so, eternal being, the God that we're seeking out in religion, which is also spirit. Okay, that all makes a lot of sense. And there's some really interesting stuff going on here that has to do with, you could call it a very central Hegelian movement or idea that pervades not just the phenomenology, but his work more generally. The relationship between whatever is on one side. We can call it self if we want to, although, here it's not being talked about so much in terms of self and more in terms of unity and essence, spirit, eternal being. And on the other hand, it's other, right? There's a lot of other vocabulary here. Ein anderes, right? We've got sort of a self in the other, and we've got being other, anders sein, right? So there's a lot going on here in terms of alterity or otherness, and there's going to be a really interesting, is it reconciliation at this point? Maybe not, but certainly loving recognition of the other, which is at the same time one's own other. So, a lot being said there. Let's begin at the beginning. He tells us that absolute spirit, which is what we've been trying to get our hands on or get our heads around for the last several paragraphs, as pictured. Now, this is very important. We've been talking a lot about Vorstellung throughout the religion section, and particularly in the paragraphs that lead up to this one, particularly in the last paragraph, where it's the Vorstellung, the picture thinking or representation of the community, and there's an inadequacy to Vorstellungen, the plural of Vorstellung, right? There's a problematic status to it. It separates things out that aren't truly separate and which should be realized as connected together. And this happens quite a bit in religion with the believer, God. Prime example of this is the unhappy consciousness that we've referenced a number of times in here. But it also comes up in terms of the conflict between, that's discussed in the spirit section, the laws of the city, the laws of the gods, different conceptions of what really matters. And, we could multiply instances. So, absolute spirit is being pictured, vorgestellt, right? And it's being pictured, as he says, in pure essence, in reine Wesen, right? And he says it's not indeed abstract pure essence. Well, that's an interesting distinction to make there, isn't it? Distinction will come up a little bit later as well. Unterschied. So, absolute spirit that is being pictured or being represented, being understood imaginatively. Even we could use the word conceptually, provided we're not using it in a Hegelian way. The way that people have typically understood the absolute spirit. And it's not going to be something completely abstract. And yet, it certainly appears to be abstract, doesn't it? I mean, a lot of what's going on in the rest of this paragraph is about the abstraction of this absolute spirit as pure essence. Now, why? Abstract essence has sunk to the level, has fallen, has gone from a higher state to a lower state, sunk to the level of merely being an element, just because it is only a moment in spirit, or as Miller is going to interpolate, the life of spirit. So we've got spirit, which is what we're trying to understand here, which is also what we're involved in, and what all the human beings before us who were engaged in religion were trying to make sense of as well. And so there's a circularity or reflexivity here. So we're trying to make sense of this, and the abstraction of it becomes just a moment or an element. Now, whenever we hear these terms, moment or element, there's a bigger picture, right? There's something larger going on, that something can be a moment within. That's one part of what it means to be a moment. Element, kind of similar as well. What else is involved there? And this kind of prefigures this whole dialectical exposition of essence being to its other. Well, things are connected with each other. You don't have just isolated moments. I mean, you can isolate them out if you want to. That's certainly possible to do. That's what, in fact, Vorstellung, representation, or also, jumping ahead a little bit, Darstellung kind of does. But that's not yet where we want to be in terms of, as we see in the end of the paragraph, the notion or the concept, the Begriff, right? It is actually, you could say, the measure of an inadequate concept. We should actually jump ahead to this final thing, right? He says, spirit that is expressed in the element of pure thought is itself essentially this, to be not merely in this element, to be actual spirit. We'll talk about that in a moment. Here's the key that we want. For in its notion lies otherness itself. In its Begriff, in the Begriff of actual spirit, or spirit that is expressed in the element of pure thought, is otherness. And what is that? The supersession of the pure notion that is only thought. The pure notion, the reine Begriff, is not truly notion. It's thought, it's just thought, and it's not yet actuality. We'll come back to that in a moment. But it gives you an idea about the inadequacy of representation. So he goes on. The representation, now he's using a different term. If you're reading the Miller translation, you might not realize that Hegel here has moved from, Vorgestellt to Darstellung. Both are Stellen words, right? We haven't seen Darstellung come up since around the 620s in this. It actually was being used quite a bit earlier on in the religion section, for the late 500s into the early 600s. But it hasn't popped up again until now. You say, well, what's the difference between Vorstellung and Darstellung? Well, there's more of a connotation of the putting it there. I mean, Vorstellung is literally putting it in front of us, or something you could say in place of another. We think of a semiotic relation to it to some degree, right? Darstellung has more of a spatial sense to it, right? But it's pretty closely connected. So the representation of spirit in this element, what element? The element of abstract pure essence, is charged with the same defect, the same lack, Mangel in German, a void of form, which essence as such has. Essence has a lack of form? Well, it does at this point, right? And this is kind of interesting. This is a little bit of a digression here. We're often trying to grasp what is essential. What is the most important thing that's going on here? What can we bullet point out? What can we, put into a single sentence to encapsulate this? I mean, Miller actually does something like that in the back of his own work, right? You can see here there's all these little paragraph numbers, then he gives you like one or two sentences about what's happening, a summary in that paragraph. Well, that's not the full dialectic, right? Nor should it be taken as a substitute for the dialectic. And, there's a problem there. When we think that we've grasped the essential, sometimes we haven't actually grasped the essential. One of the good things about dialectical philosophy is it can unpack for us what's actually going on in the background, what's missing, what yet still has to come, what is desirable, what we have to start looking for. And anyway, let's go on. Don't want to belabor this point too much. So he says that essence is an abstraction and is therefore the negation of its simple unitary nature. It is an other. So essence or Wesen, right, is negation, negative, right, in German. So it's the, if we want to be a little bit more literal, it's the negative because it's abstract, right? And it's the negative of its simple unitary nature, which is just Einheit here, right? And what is this going to mean? Well, there's an otherness involved. Essence is not just its simple unitary nature. It is its simple unitary nature, but it's also its negation. So essence is more complicated than we think it to be. It's not just a simple thing. He goes on and he adds to this picture, similarly, spirit in the element of essence, right? So spirit in the element of this represented, dargestellt as essence, as simple essence. Spirit in this element of essence is the form. Oh, I thought we were lacking form here. Well, now we have a form that's being restored. But what is it? The form of simple oneness. And so we had Einheit. Now we have einfachen Einheit. So the form of simple oneness. We've got unitary nature, unity, Einheit, oneness. And it's simple. It's one-fold, literally. And now, that's kind of funny to think about. We often contrast the manifold to the simple, right? The manifold has got many different folds, Mannigfaltigkeit. Einfach, right? There's only one way that this is. a form of, it's sort of like unity that has been made more unified, unity that has been made more simple, or we could say simplicity that is even more simple. And why? Because there's this intricate connection between essence and spirit, which is being depicted, is being put forth in the element of essence. Okay, so we've got two things now that are connected together, and they both have this othering going on. What else? Then he says, what is the same thing? Okay, this tells us right here what's happening with these is also what's happening with this third one. What is it? So, the relation of the eternal being to its being for self. So the eternal being, God, right? The relation, the Beziehung, to its being for self. It's für sich sein. Well, this is important because now we have a kind of agency and, reflection going on within the eternal being. And he says this is the immediately simple one, again, Einheit, right, of pure thought. And immediately simple, it's actually hyphenated in the German, unmittelbares einfach, right? So same vocabulary coming up in all of these, of pure thought. Now, what happens with all of these? So essence is an other, ein anderes, right? Spirit, he says, therefore is equally, essentially, wesentliche, right? So spirit, which is in the element of essence, is essentially an othering, anders Wesen, of itself, a becoming other of itself. So now we've got is an other, becomes an other, and then he says the relation of the eternal being to its being for self, immediate, simple of pure thought. And what do we have going on here now? In this simple beholding, anschauen, right, of itself in the other, the otherness is therefore not posited as such, nicht als solche gesetzt, right? So we've got the being other happening here, anders sein. Now we've got like otherness or alterity, becoming other, the othering of the self, the being other, and beholding of itself in the other. This is a very complex and rich discussion of alterity, isn't it? Here's where we get to the really interesting, meaty stuff. In this simple beholding of itself in the otherness is therefore not posited as such, not put there, gesetzt. It is the difference, Unterschied, right, a division, which in pure thought, the pure thought of the eternal being is immediately no difference, kein Unterschied. And what is this? Hegel now changes to a very, very different vocabulary. One that's, so rich in implications. It is a loving recognition, ein Anerkennen der Liebe. Love is being invoked here now, right? Anerkennen, this is something that from the very beginning, and especially, made explicit in the self-consciousness section, this is what we're looking for. Anerkennen, right? Mutual recognition or acknowledgement. And this is a recognition of love, through love, by love, with love, right? The der there could mean a lot of different things. A loving recognition in which the two sides, as regards their essence, their Wesen again, do not stand in an antithetical relation with each other. As a matter of fact, antithetical is not the right word to use there. They're not even opposed. To be antitheses to each other is a little bit stronger than mere opposition. Entgegengesetzt is the German word that's being used there. They are not entgegengesetzt. They are not being opposed to each other in this loving recognition. And then he says something, and the stuff that we talked about just a little bit earlier, this is, really a capstone here. Spirit that is expressed in the element of pure thought. So we might say, oh, element of pure thought, really abstract there, Hegel. Well, yes and no. Is itself essentially this. Again, Wesentliche, right? To be not merely in this element. To be pure thought requires that we go beyond pure thought. We go into an otherness. To grasp that concretely means what? To be actual spirit, Wirkliche, to be real, to attain reality, right? And this, he says, to be actual spirit, for in its notion, in its Begriff, lies otherness itself. Once again, the alterity that we cannot avoid. And what is this? He says, well, the supersession of the pure notion that is only thought. The supersession, the Aufheben, this is the term that we see over and over again in the phenomenology, right? The supersession of a notion that is not yet a full notion. This is how notions develop. The notion in this case of God, of the God that we've been seeking in religion. So there's an awful lot going on here in this short paragraph. The element of pure thought, because it is an abstract element, is itself rather the other of its simple unitary nature, and therefore passes over into the element proper to picture thinking. The element in which the moments of the pure notion obtain a substantial existence relatively to one another, and also are subjects which do not possess for a third the indifference towards each other of mere being, but being reflected into themselves spontaneously part asunder, and also place themselves over against each other. Paragraph 773 is a follow-up to the paragraph that we've just looked at, paragraph 772. There's a lot of the same terminology and language and ideas being worked out in here, but we've got a few other important developments that are going to lead us now into being able to go more concrete, more substantial in the paragraphs about to come. So he starts by talking about this element of pure thought, which we saw that absolute spirit is going to be articulating itself in, and that this element of pure thought cannot just be pure thought, or it sort of sinks to the level of an abstraction. And we saw a lot of discussion in the previous paragraph about this simple unitary nature or simplicity or oneness, Einheit in this case, right? And we had Einfach, Einheit. This is something important to this element of pure thought. He says, this element of pure thought, because it is an abstract element, and now we get something really interesting. We've already talked about otherness just in the previous paragraph, and now otherness is being talked about in yet another way, right? The element of pure thought is itself, because it's abstract, the other of its simple unitary nature, so it cannot be simple. It already introduces alterity within itself, as we saw in the previous paragraph, and now it passes over, geht über, right? Übergehen transforms into, lapses into. These are all ways that we could think of this, and it transforms into another element. So we've got an element transforming or passing over into an element. What is the element here? The element proper to picture thinking, right? The eigentlich element, the one that belongs to representation. And, what would we say about that? Well, isn't that just representation itself? Yes, representation always turns out to be more complex. There's more going on than we thought. And interestingly, in this, something is going to be able to happen. So he says, the element proper to picture thinking is the element in which the moments of the pure notion, the reine Begriff, right, what we concluded the last paragraph with a supersession or, going beyond and incorporating the pure notion that is only thought. And this is leading us to actual spirit. Spirit in, to prefigure a little bit, spirit in the world, right? Spirit of a world. So he goes on and he says, these moments of the pure notion, which would otherwise just be merely abstract, they obtain, they get something, erhalten. And what do they get? Well, they get two things, and they also aren't something else in the description. They gain substantial existence, Dasein. So, the Dasein of substances, this is just a cognate, the English to the German, substantiale Dasein, right? So, in the pure notion, these moments are now gaining substantial existence. But, now, this is very important, because in picture thinking, there's a risk of each of them getting a substantial existence that's disconnected from the other. But in this case, it's relatively to each other, right? So, what is the term there? Gegeneinander. So, in the previous paragraph, we saw that there was a distinction, an Unterschied that was, or division that was no longer being divided in pure thought. We saw that there was an overcoming of antithesis, or rather opposition. In this case, we have opposition, and in a kind of strong sense, Gegeneinander, right, which makes us think of Gegensatz, contradiction. So we have a restoration within the element proper to picture thinking of what the pure notion can provide us with, which is moments that actually can be opposed to each other. And opposed to each other in, if we want to piggyback off of this substantiality of existence, in substantial ways. It goes further, right? He also says that they are subjects. And here's something, here's what's being left out, which do not possess for a third the indifference, Gleichgültigkeit, the, it's just as good, everything is just fine. They're not all on the same level necessarily. For a third, the indifference towards each other of mere being, but instead being reflected into themselves, in sich reflektiert, right? What happens with this reflection into themselves? They spontaneously part asunder, but also, and now notice once again, place themselves over against each other and gegenstellen. Now, this is a really interesting term to use, right? And gegen, right? Sort of like the Gegeneinander, the opposition is now back. Stellen. In the previous paragraph, we had Vorstellen, Vorstellung, right? And we had Darstellen. Now, and Gegenstellen. It's not representation anymore. It's rather placing themselves in relation to each other and opposed to each other, right? So there's something really quite cool happening here, you could say, through this passing over of the element of pure thought into the element proper to picture thinking. It allows the pure notion to have this differentiation within itself, and a differentiation that isn't just like, well, there's abstract ideas that can be distinguished from each other. No, we're getting something more concrete here, something more wirklich, is something more actual.